Well, I mean, change is a snail often, as we say in German. I don't even know if that works in English, but it processes very, very slowly sometimes. So even like if a protest doesn't achieve a result like the very next day, it lays groundwork for the future.
Dear friends, welcome to another edition of Forum 2000 online chat, where we discuss the issues of freedom and democracy in these complex and complicated times. My name is Jakub Klepal. I'm the director of Forum 2000, and given the topic of our Forum 2000 online chat, the challenges to democracy, today we have probably one of the best people in the world to talk about that. Let me welcome here Anna Lührmann, who is a researcher, a university professor, a former politician. She used to be a member of the German Bundestag for the Green Party, and currently she co-runs Varieties of Democracy, which is a project based at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and which measures the state and development of democracy around the world. They employ or they cooperate with about 3,000 country experts around the world in over 200 countries, and they have very interesting results. So let's go right into it. Anna, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Anna, in your latest 2019 V-Dem report, you note that the third wave of autocratization is advancing. It's indeed actually speeding up. It's becoming more significant. You say that there is for the first time since 2001, there is a majority of countries in the world that are not democracies. This is, if I have the numbers correctly, 48% of the countries, with about 46% of the population which are democracies, and the rest are not democracies. And you also say that in 2019 we have lost 8 democracies. So can you explain that a little bit? How have you arrived at these results, and how do you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here at the V-Dem Institute, we measure and we look at democracy in a very deep way. So we don't only look at the question, for example, whether or not multi-party elections took place, but we really think about whether these elections and these democratic procedures really allow citizens to have a voice, and really speaks truth to the claim that it's ruled by the people, right? And as we've just seen in Belarus, you can have elections even with multiple candidates that are extremely rigged already way before the election day actually takes place. So we look at that deep level of democracy, and here we've seen, unfortunately, starting basically with Russia in the mid-90s, when it became clear that Russia wouldn't develop so easily into a democracy. We've seen that this sort of spread out to other countries, and that other countries followed that pathway of sort of gradually undermining democratic standards. Most of these countries still hold elections, but for example, the media is not free, or opposition candidates are in prison, or as in the Hungarian case, the government or the government party controls most of the media. So these kind of very gradual, very subtle restrictions, that's what we're seeing around the world, and that's what we're seeing progressing. And I think it progresses for several reasons. First of all, because some major countries are affected, like Russia, like the United States, like Brazil, like Venezuela. So countries that are big regional players that then affect other countries to follow them. And second of all, we also have some factors that are similar around the world. For example, the spread of social media, which makes it so easy to spread disinformation, to mobilize for candidates that want to erode democracy. We also see that an increasing social inequality after the financial crisis, potentially even more now after the corona crisis. And these are all things, in addition with like a big cultural change, cultural modernizations, that make people more prone to vote for parties that are less committed to democratic norms as we would want to see it. So that's sort of what is driving this third wave of autocratization, and we see it unfolding more and more each year.
And do you see a trend for even more acceleration? Because as you wrote in the report, there is an accelerating trend. So do you see that some of these tendencies that you've just described will in fact be sort of going to be more severe, and the loss of democracies will become even greater?
So we clearly see that more countries are affected, and we see also that in those countries that are affected, the trend cuts deeper. So, for example, if you think about Hungary, Hungary was still considered a democracy by us 3 years ago, but now with this move that I just described, sort of the foundation of the Fidesz party concentrating large parts of the media, that sort of pushed it then over the threshold, and it's now classified as an electoral autocracy, just below the threshold. So there's also, it can quickly move back up. So these kind of deepening tendencies we've seen in a number of countries. Turkey would be one of them. In Turkey, really, you see sort of in our data, you can very nicely see how sort of each year it became worse. And basically, and I think there also have been academic papers out on this now, that there's a logic to this, right? If these, what we call electoral autocrats, if they remove one constraint on them, for example, there's one less newspaper that can criticize them, that then makes it easier for them to do the next move, for example, to remove judges that they don't like, or to limit the influence of the legislature. So it's basically, it makes it easier and easier. And particularly what I'm really worried about, once they control sort of the public sphere, then citizens don't hear anymore about opposing views, and then it's very difficult for citizens before an election to form their opinion, because they only get biased news from the side of the government, and then elections appear free, but they actually are not, because this information is not free. And this is something that we really see, and this is what we see rising. On the other hand, what we also see, and what we also point out in the report, is that resistance is growing. So that's the title of the report also that points that out, right? And we see resistance growing mainly in the form of citizens that are protesting, so that are fighting against this trend. And we've seen that in Hong Kong, we've seen that in Sudan, where citizens successfully toppled the dictator. We're seeing it right now in Belarus, where citizens are trying to achieve that. So we've seen in a number of countries, including your own, but also in Turkey, we've seen that opposition candidates win major municipal elections. So we see resistance, we see resilience that is still there, and that's why I'm not so gloomy. I still think, yes, we see this trend, we see this wave of autocratization, but we also see forces of resilience that are also growing, and particularly through people's protests, people's movements, and that makes me actually hopeful for the state of democracy and the future of democracy.
Yeah, that's indeed a bright spot in the report. You actually even call it the largest pro-democracy movement of all time, 2019, which is interesting. I never thought of it like that. But why you think is that is happening? Because of this advance of autocratization? Is this a reaction to it, or what was the reason?
Exactly. We looked into it where we see those protests. We see that partially in autocracies, like now this year in Belarus. And Belarus has been a very severe autocracy for a long time, and now and also in Sudan, for example, there was a military dictatorship actually for decades, right? And then all of a sudden, people say enough is enough, and we won't accept. In the case of Belarus, these rigged elections. In the case of Sudan, the economic hardship anymore, right? So there's this movement against against dictators. And I think this also gets inspired by the same process that inspires autocratization in other places, which is the free flow of information through the internet, for example. So citizens are aware of a freer way of life, of how governments should be run, right? And they take this as a role model to demand the same dignity and rights for themselves. So that's one process that we see. And then indeed, we see the other protest of citizens pushing back in the case of autocratization, so of governments undermining democratic rule. Hong Kong is the most prominent example of that, obviously. But also in Poland and Hungary, we've seen protests against movements of the government, for example, to curtail the judiciary.
From your global perspective, do you think that these movements can be or are successful in the long run? Because you mentioned Hong Kong, you mentioned Belarus, you mentioned what has happened in Hungary, the civic movements. None of them has so far been successful. On the other hand, I mean, in Hong Kong we see a very negative developments. We have seen in you mentioned my country Czechia, we had a very large demonstrations last year. Nothing much changed. I mean, the mood is certainly a little different, but the impact is sort of to be seen. So how do you evaluate that? Can these movements actually change things, or do they change things?
Well, I mean, change is a snail often, as we say in German. I don't even know if that works in English, but so it processes very, very slowly sometimes. So even like if a protest doesn't achieve a result like the very next day, it lays groundwork for the future. Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in some countries, like, I mean, Sudan is of course one example. Now we've actually seen a transition to a transitional government that now is about to organize elections. Faces now a lot of challenges through the Corona crisis. So I think that's also maybe one reason why some of these processes, of course, got stalled now in spring and summer of this year, because many people don't protest anymore because they want to follow the guidances of social distancing, right, or physical distancing. So it's sort of it became a little bit sort of everything broke down a little bit. It became a bit difficult now in spring to maintain the pressure on governments. It was sort of like the Corona crisis interrupted a lot of dynamics and processes there. Also, this happened also to Fridays for Future, right? So I think this is something that we see, but we clearly see in countries, also Armenia, all the color revolutions. We see many countries where protest leads to regime change and successful and long-term regime change. And we're actually currently working on a paper which we will present at the American Political Science Association's conference now in 2 weeks, where we show clearly that the increase of pro-democratic demonstrations is associated with an increase in democracy in the next year. This is clearly, like on average, this is statistically very robust, and we show that very clearly.
Well, that's hopeful. But turning to the sort of the current situation, you have also done some evaluations of how COVID pandemic is influencing democracy, and how the governmental measures against the spread of the pandemic or spread of the virus have influenced democracy, and we have all been quite concerned in the beginning that there were some of these measures may stay in place, and the limitations on freedom, etc. You actually have been saying recently that in Europe, for example, none of that happened, and you're quite optimistic. Are you still optimistic now? And moreover, what do you think will happen? Not so much because of the pandemic, but because of the potential economic crisis or economic slowdown that may come, now in the following months. May that be a negative influence?
Yeah, so first of all, we started a whole new project when the crisis started, or basically in April, that we call pandemic backsliding, precisely because we were super worried that what we've seen in Hungary, for example, where the government really expanded its power beyond what was necessary to fight the virus, that we would see that in many other countries, and so we've clearly put that on a watch list, or put countries sort of under close scrutiny. And we initially also saw some concerning developments in other European countries outside of Hungary, where it came to discrimination against minorities, the Roma in particular, when it came to access for the media to information. Spain, for example, in the beginning wouldn't really allow journalists access to information. Then after protests from journalists, they changed that. So yes, we can say that in many countries the initial fears didn't come true, but in some countries they did. And so we identify now a list of 7 countries where we say there's a high risk of what we call pandemic backsliding. This is El Salvador in Latin America, where really, they also had a change in government shortly before the crisis, but now really the government uses the crisis to basically just ignore all the rule of law and any human dignity. Hungary, everybody knows already enough about. India, it's mainly the arbitrary enforcement. They adjourned the legislature, completely unnecessary. Philippines, arbitrary enforcement mainly. Serbia, we see all sorts of problems, violations sort of across the scale, and similarly also in Sri Lanka and Uganda. And I took care of the sort of calling out these countries now because our work now makes it very clear that you can fight and address the pandemic without violating democratic standards. And in fact, we also have another paper for the American Political Science Association conference now, where we show that there's no correlation between violation of democratic standards and COVID-19 related death rates. So it means if you violate democratic standards, you can't justify that by saying that you're more efficient as a government. That's not the case. So this is, I think it's important still, because the crisis will continue, unfortunately, probably for rather quite some time. So we have to keep watch on these governments, and we're doing that for the rest of this year. But I also agree with you that the long-term or medium-term consequences for democracy might even be more dramatic, right? If we, which is very likely, or we're already in the middle of it, face an economic crisis now due to the pandemic, of course, this is something that populist, that illiberal parties will use to mobilize for their agendas. Until now, they haven't done so very successfully because they also don't have the answer to how to fight the pandemic. But of course, we can be afraid that this might happen at some point. Plus, another trend that we describe as really worrisome in our 2019 report is polarization of society, right? That we see not a healthy discussion about political issues, but that we see really like opposing camps that don't talk to each other anymore. And this is really poisonous for democracy. And this increases now in the pandemic, because those, for example, that support the wearing of face masks and those that don't, they get into really, really nasty arguments every day. And that makes it very difficult for the trust that we need for democracies to work to sustain. So those are two things that I worry about: the economic crisis and the polarization that is fostered by the crisis.
And we'll watch that. We'll be interested how that develops. Thank you, Anna, very much for the talk, for the interview. I wish you all the best. I hope you are well and safe in Sweden, and hopefully talk to you soon in Prague or anywhere or somewhere else. Take care.
I hope so too. Thank you, Jakob. Yeah, thanks for your interest.
Bye-bye.
Bye.